Hello, hello, hello. What if the greatest threat to investment migration today isn't regulation, but misreading risk? In a world shaped by sanctions, geopolitical fragmentation, reputational scrutiny, and rapid capital movement, risk has become more than a compliance issue. It has become a strategic differentiator. To help us unpack how risk governance is evolving under global pressure and the role played by strategic intelligence, today we are joined by Fabienne de Blois, head of the investment migration governance practice at Control Risk. Fabienne, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tessa. It's great to be here and looking forward to CIS 26, of course.
Well, we met originally at CIS 25. So this one this year is it's going to be completely different. It sounds amazing. There's a few surprises in store. Okay.
Sounds amazing. I loved CIS 25 as well. I mean, I think that was pulled off excellently. So I have no doubt that we're going to meet that standard and exceed.
So for those of us who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Fabienne, and I work for a firm called Control Risks. I've been working in intelligence, and when we say intelligence, I mean it in a commercial and a business sense, so not state intelligence, for 14 years now. And I actually began my career at Control Risks, which is a global firm with 41 global offices. And then I left Control Risks after a few years and worked for various other firms. At one of those firms in 2018, I came across CBI, so Citizenship by Investment. And since 2018, it's been a key focus for me from the point of view of due diligence, but also looking at opportunity for the industry, for the governments themselves that operate programs in the Caribbean.
So what was it that appealed to you about the CBI program?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, that's a multifaceted question. We fall into things. So I had worked in risk and intelligence and in business intelligence with a Middle East focus for quite a number of years before I discovered CBI and the sort of specific risks attached to it. CBI is almost like an anomaly, or I would want to say a dichotomy, because there's so much opportunity, both for the investor and obviously the state and projects that are being invested in. And yet there's so much risk, right? A passport is such a heavy document. It is, and I know that we're probably going to move into these topics later on in the podcast. It's the kind of document that traditionally has been very hard to revoke. And it's also the sort of document and entitlement that gets inherited by people. Right. And so, the juxtapositioning of the heaviness of that document with the opportunity that it offers investors and countries that are being invested in is really, really appealing to me. From a sort of practitioner perspective, as an intelligence professional, it's also really interesting to look at the investors themselves. Why? Because a lot of them have made money despite the odds. Right? They live in, and not all of them, but they live and operate in environments and contexts where you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next year. And it can be really, really interesting to see how people do succeed commercially and personally, despite all the sort of ambient or contextual or circumstantial risks that might actually be the triggers of their application. So things like security and regulatory sort of uncertainty are often part of the reason that investors do come to these programs as well.
So I can honestly tell you, I've been looking forward to this conversation because, as we all know, the CBI program has been the forefront in the news lately. And there's a lot of misinformation by some country leaders. They put the wrong information out, and this is an opportunity for us to make it clear how secure this program is and how, what risks there are and what benefits there are. So let's jump into it. Control Risks has built a global reputation in strategic intelligence. What does that mean in today's investment migration environment?
Absolutely. So I guess strategic intelligence is all about looking forward as well as looking backwards. So advising organizations of all types, be they commercial, be they government, on the risks and the opportunities. And we very much see risk and opportunity as two sides of the same coin attached to a transaction or a longer term partnership. And I think one thing that's really interesting about what's happening in CBI, particularly since 2024, when the regional regulator started sort of being seriously talked about, is that much more there is a push towards a partnership with the investor. So it's not a one-off transaction, it's a partnership. And that's where the strategic element of intelligence is so important. But as I say, risk and opportunity are two sides of the same thing. So in understanding the risks attached to the application at the applicant or investor onboarding stage, we're also looking at the triggers for their application. We're looking at why are they applying today? Why not 3 years ago? What's making them apply? That helps us paint a picture of the risks attached. So are there nefarious reasons for the application, but also the opportunities for the programs? Is there a market that potentially hasn't been cornered? Are there justifications and reasons why applicants are coming to programs that maybe haven't been appreciated?
Understood. That's something I didn't think about either. So, what shifts in global risk have most directly impacted capital mobility in the past 24 months?
Wow. I mean, I guess it depends what part of the world you're from, in order to answer that question. I'm sure that at CIS 26, there will be a lot of scrutiny on what is making US investors want to seek alternatives, right? Either physical alternatives, like actually living outside of the US, or maybe just diversifying any investment portfolios they may have outside of the US. My focus being in London and very much being sort of Middle East, Africa, and East Asia focused is also other things. And if you look at East Asia, you can see that there is, that the strategic competition between the US and China has really ramped up in the last 2 years or 1 year even. There are also a lot of concerns I think investors are having around privacy and around the integrity of their identity information. And a lot of the time, these privacy concerns are also triggers for applications. Could it be that investors are looking at living in a jurisdiction or keeping assets in a jurisdiction legally, of course, but where privacy is not such a big concern? And the last bit, I guess, is just regulatory uncertainty. I wouldn't ever say that risk has increased, and I guess it's not really possible for one individual organization to really holistically, on a global scale, say risks are increasing. But it's definitely fair to say that regulatory and legal uncertainty on a global scale is increasing. And so we've seen a lot of shifts in regulation, particularly as regards to privacy laws and the way that data is shared between countries, but also lots of legal shifts as well in the last sort of 2 years that really directly impact CBI programs.
Agreed, agreed. In your view, has risk increased globally, or are we simply just more aware of it?
I guess it depends who you ask, right? Again, and I think the globe is a very big place. So there are definitely sectors and parts of the world that are less risky today than they were sort of 5 years ago. There are sectors and geographies and demographics as well that are very much exposed to more risk. So I think it's less about whether risk has increased, but it's just much more. I mean, one thing is that the programs have matured. So a lot of the programs in the Caribbean were actually only really scaled sort of between 10 and 12 years ago. And institutionally, that's not a long time. And so the opportunities and the in-house knowledge and the understanding of the markets that they're dealing with, which are global markets, is definitely maturing. And I think that both presents an opportunity for the programs, but it also probably means that those people operating the programs are more cognizant of risks than they were sort of 10 years ago. They understand the markets better. We all understand the markets better than we did 10 years ago.
Agreed, agreed. So, from your vantage point, where is the investment industry most exposed right now?
I think there are two things. So I think the first one has actually been a persisting risk ever since these programs were first formed. And it is a risk that you see time in and time out where major international, either media or diplomatic or both, scrutiny comes to play. And it's around identity fraud. So that assurance that the individual making the application is who they say they are is actually harder than we think, right? So again, There is a lot we can do in the due diligence process, and at control risks, we're thinking predominantly about this because the due diligence we do for global banks and for large corporations includes most of the anti-bribery and AML and compliance sort of considerations anyway, as well as a bit of political risk. But I guess what's specific about due diligence for CBI units is also making sure that the identity of the applicant is fully understood. To the extent that the applicant is not applying on behalf of another person to whom they may pass that passport, and to the extent that the applicant is not using fake, forged, or just misappropriated documents. And actually, that last bit is the most important. Can we be sure that that passport that the applicant has presented is theirs? It's not someone who looks like them. It's not someone maybe with a slightly different, maybe a cousin or a friend, or someone potentially that they have an arrangement with.
Right.
And I think this is where biometrics come in. Definitely. There are things we do in due diligence to verify identity, but that is not biometric. And so it's really about the collection of biometrics by the government via intermediaries that I think is one of the key risks. And the other key risk, and I think this is much more of a horizon sort of risk rather than a risk that existed 10 years ago, is around digital sovereignty. So it's around countries increasingly putting regulation in place to prevent the transfer of information, including information about a person's identity out of a country. And it's also about making sure during the due diligence process, and that's because that's my focus, that information about a person's identity, their name, their date of birth, and other really sensitive information is not shared haphazardly. Is not shared with third-party contractors, is not shared with, members of the wider business community, and then it becomes sort of in the possession of parties, let's say, that could use it for other purposes. So that's one of the key risks, and I can see this coming to the fore with GDPR, with other privacy regulation outside of the EU also really being sort of part of the spotlight in 2026 and 2027.
Agreed. Again, I told you I was looking forward to this conversation because you are enlightening me to a whole bunch of other aspects that I just did not consider whatsoever. This is great. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. So, how does strategic intelligence underpin, support sovereignty, credibility, and capital access for small island nations running a CBI program like this?
Such a good question. So, I think I sometimes just sort of step back when I think about the populations of the Eastern Caribbean islands that run these programs. Very small populations in a global, comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
Most of these islands have, and I think it's safe to say that the resident population is less than 100,000 people in almost all cases, right? And, the Caribbean is known for its resilience, its historical resilience, its links to the whole world, right? And I think it's agility in terms of sort of just changing what the economy is based on so quickly. The Caribbean also has a massive global footprint, and I'm thinking both financially, obviously, but culturally, Caribbean music is known across the world, Caribbean food is known across the world, all of that. So all of that, I think, puts the Eastern Caribbean, but the Caribbean in general, in a really good position to be able to truly understand global markets. But the small populations are obviously a hindrance. And let's say also the fact that programs have only been around for 10 years, which institutionally, as I said, is not a very long time. And so, of course, I mean, there are a lot of conversations. I'm probably not the best person to talk about them. CBI can support sovereignty, right? In the sense that it supports direct capital that doesn't come with debt, right? I think everyone in the policy-making space also acknowledges that CBI is not a solution in and of itself. It's a means to an end. It's part of a puzzle. So CBI finance can only ever be one source of revenue. It should never be the only source of revenue, obviously, for a government. And I guess then the question comes, how are the CBI funds being invested for the longer term diversification and stability and sustainability of the economy? And I think some of the stories coming out of most of the islands actually that run the Caribbean Five anyway, that run citizenship by investment programs, but I would call out specifically St. Kitts and Antigua, for really, and probably others as well, for really looking at longer term energy alternatives and putting funding into those longer term energy infrastructure alternatives. Dominica also is another good example of that. So, if CBI funds can literally transform a country's energy dependence on the US or Cuba or Venezuela, that's so transformational. And again, this is the narrative that we don't hear a lot in London, which is where I'm based, or in Brussels. The transformational power of this finance. The fact that it is not seen as a short-term sort of goal in itself, that it is part of a longer road and project to build sovereignty, right?
Right. So I think one of the things that I take away locally, the people on the island need to be informed of this as well. We do know that, because we're in this industry, we understand that, but I believe all the islands need to do a better job at explaining that to the locals that actually reside there. I mean, that would be, make it much easier for the locals to understand the benefits as well, the long-term benefits, as you said. So, what separates compliance driven due diligence from intelligence led risk management?
Ooh, big question. And I say this specifically because as I say, I work in commercial intelligence, right? And I've met so many people in my industry across the world that frown upon the word compliance. They call it, the C word, like it's a really bad thing. And what they mean is not that that organizations should not comply. They mean that compliance-driven due diligence is boring. Maybe it's retrospective. It only looks at what has happened in the past. It doesn't look forward. And that it's binary in the sense of there being a yes/no answer or a very simple answer to a question. Ask any lawyer, and particularly lawyers, obviously, that support corporates and organizations, and they will tell you that's further from the truth than anything else, right? Compliance is not simple. Whether or not a program, so the programs are arm's length sometimes, but ultimately they are government agencies or bodies accountable to governments. Whether or not they are compliant is actually an incredibly complex question. And the first sort of part of that is, who are they complying with? And ultimately we have a multipolar world here, and we have a multipolar environment in which different regulation and expectations, both explicitly in terms of regulation and legislation, but implicitly in terms of diplomatic power, are being set all at the same time. And I guess, that is the ultimate, that's what the life of a compliance officer and actually a strategic sort of CEO at a program is like. They have to satisfy US expectations and potentially also expectations of other bodies. What about the UK? What about China? What about the OECS?
Right.
And so I don't think compliance is simple. But I will say that often when we talk about compliance due diligence, as I said, it implies simplicity, it implies a lack of context, and it also implies that the due diligence provider only reports what has happened, not what might happen in the future. And at control risks, we are very focused on what might happen in the future as well. So a lot of the time we find issues attached to applications maybe that are talked about, very in very discrete circles, but aren't in the media. And it's important that we tell our client about those issues, not because there is reputational exposure today for the islands. It could be that today, if it were to become public that a person had been naturalized, that would be fine. But what about 10 years later? Could an issue escalate? Could it become a sort of, the center of a media controversy or a regulatory action that then sort of, interests the world and attracts media attention? So strategic intelligence, I mean, it's just a term. It's a term that's used in lots of different contexts in different ways. But I think for us, it means looking forward and looking at contextual risk, looking at gaps in information, as well as overt allegations.
So you've kind of hit on my next question. Why should international marketing agents, banks, regulators, and CBI units consider strategic intelligence a competitive advantage and not an expense?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess it comes down to risk and opportunity being two sides of the same coin, ultimately, right? If you understand the risks attached to one applicant, it's also about understanding the opportunities attached to other applicants in that context, or potentially also cutting through the noise. So we often come across applicants that present a lot of ambient or generic risks. They may operate in a country that is seen as risky. They may operate in a sector that is seen as risky. But really digging under that and looking at their own track record and probity and the perceived reputation of their own operations, you can cut through. And sometimes what you find is that though on paper, at first glance, an application looks risky, actually, there are ways to mitigate that risk through inquiries, through making sure that, I don't know, to use an example, a company that trades with a high risk jurisdiction, making sure that everything is tip top in terms of the audit trail and the tender sort of trail and the perceived probity of any partners they have in that high risk jurisdiction. So risk and opportunity are interlinked. You can't really understand risk without understanding opportunity and vice versa. We can't understand opportunity without understanding risk.
It's an advantage to have this knowledge. It's, the
Definitely.
expense of having it is not the point. It's just an advantage to have it. It benefits everyone. So if a CBI program misreads today's geopolitical signals, what's the real cost?
It's a really good question. And I don't think that cost is just financial. I mean, there'll be a lot of talk at CIS about reputational sort of damage and what that really means. And I guess in asking what's the real cost, we can have various scenarios, but we can't tell you exactly what the real cost might
Right.
be. I do think that one thing particularly the Caribbean Five have been increasingly looking at and that we've been helping them look at is policy changes and sort of superpower sort of maneuvers as well, right? So, what does it say, for example, looking at Pacific Islands? There is a lot of competition right now between the US and China, as I said before, in the Pacific, as in
Yeah.
Africa and actually in Latin America as well. And so just making sure that they understand the real life regulatory sort of implications of that power play at a macro level on small countries that maybe their investors are coming from is really, really important. But I think, that also feeds into understanding opportunity, and I think, and again, the populations of the Caribbean islands that have these programs are so small. The programs are often very, very busy as well. So making sure they're not just looking at the generic AML and counter-terrorist financing and sanctions risks, while important, they're not just looking at those, but they're also looking at markets that maybe haven't been discovered and looking to understand what triggers there may be for applications from those markets. And one thing that I think is increasingly becoming evident is that individuals are not just investing in citizenship in order to gain Schengen or UK visa-free access, right? There are lots of other reasons. And sometimes that is about visitor mobility. It's about short-term mobility, but it may be short-term mobility to go visit, I don't know, China or India or Nigeria or
Right.
something. So I think just making sure that we're aware of opportunity as well will help us understand risk and vice versa.
It's interesting because you're clearing up a lot of misconceptions right now. Like you said, some people think, oh, it's only to get into the US. It's only, and the interesting thing, a lot of big countries look at the small islands and think that, oh, because it's a small island, you run the risk of allowing in the criminal, allowing in this
Yeah,
person, and not realizing how strict and how deep the due diligence is. It's even harder to get this passport than it is to get a visa to visit those countries. The type of information that they have to give, to present in order to do this means that this small country is doing, going above and beyond to verify these people before we allow them access, to the passport. So
absolutely.
again, I love this conversation. So let's move
Yeah,
over to CIS. What insights can delegates coming to CIS interacting with control risks expect to leave with that they cannot essentially get on Google?
amazing. I mean, I will not downplay the Control Risks website. Definitely check it out. And I don't lie when I say this, and I think I'm known as quite an honest person. I still, having actually rejoined Control Risk a year ago, enjoy looking at the website because there are so many cool podcasts. And actually, one of the other things on our website, right, is increasingly, well, not even increasingly, you constantly get updates about how we are expanding. I'm part of a due diligence community of practice under the auspices of the Investment Migration Council, which is better known as the IMC, and I think many listeners will know about the IMC. It's Control Risks and it's four other firms that work in due diligence for CBI units, and we frequently kind of just share case studies without sharing, confidential information about issues we've come up against and how we tackled them and different ways of looking at issues. And I feel like CIS, it definitely was last year, but this year as well would be an opportunity to just kind of broaden the audience for those kinds of stories, but also listen, right? I love going to conferences in this industry, but particularly in the Caribbean as well, because we hear the other side of the story. We hear what it's like to be an agent, a local one or an international one. And we also hear stories from investors. Like, if you just sit in front of your computer screen all day looking at reports about investors, you don't get the full picture. You hear actually, why is it that you don't want to live in Europe anymore or in the US or in Lebanon or wherever it is, right? And often, and as you said earlier, it's never just for one reason. It may relate to that stronger passport in some cases, yes, because people do want to travel, but it often relates to more than one thing, right? And it can relate to general lifestyle sort of preferences, but legal preferences, employment preferences, preferences around the right to own land and assets, etc., that
Right.
actually have to be heard from the horse's mouth, that aren't well known in the public domain.
Agreed. Completely agree. So, if you had to give one strategic warning and one strategic opportunity for this industry, what would they be?
Excellent. Can I go with the opportunity first?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
you can.
yeah. So as I said earlier, the skill sets, the human capital in the Caribbean, it has always been impressive, right? And I think it's increasing and it's becoming increasingly evident that the programs themselves have an array of skills, which is sort of unprecedented for such small countries. I think onshoring some of the knowledge that allows the programs to truly understand their investors and their investor base is incredibly important. So making sure that the units themselves that are processing applications do know how to check the QR code of the police clearance certificate, or do know what to expect when they see a Chinese name and the way it can be rendered in English, etc. Do know about, I don't know, military rule in different countries and how that actually presents risks, human rights risks, sanctions risks, etc. That's an opportunity. And it also feeds into further expansion of CBI, because me and you are in CBI to some extent, right? We think it's big. We think people understand it. But guess what? It's not just, the Financial Times or the UK government or the EU or whatever that doesn't always fully get the full picture on CBI. It's also potential investors. So I think CBI is very ill understood. Its benefits and its risks are ill understood. And the benefits of CBI are not very well understood across the world. Why? Because it is a relatively new and a relatively unprecedented phenomenon. So I've spent the last year talking to people who work at control risks offices across the world, but also people in the general business community in many different jurisdictions. And I can safely say that there are so many potential markets for CBI that are unexplored and not understood, or not sort of definitely not fully understood by CBI programs. So that's an opportunity. A risk. I guess the risk hasn't really changed. The risk is around international scrutiny. I would just highlight that I think that the two aspects I mentioned earlier, the potential for identity fraud, and there the imperative to integrate the collection of biometrics into passports is really, really important, because to my mind, that is the easiest way to address, to fully and empirically address the identity fraud issue. If you've got a passport with biometrics, then it's the safest way to protect that passport being shared or used by someone else. And the second point, I think, is around the transfer of data. So making sure that the data attached to these applications, which is very sensitive, it's financial in nature, sometimes it's very personal in nature, and it's legally protected in most parts of the world, is not shared haphazardly. And, I very much sort of say that I don't think it's necessarily the programs themselves that are sharing that data haphazardly, but it's third parties that might be sharing it haphazardly. Service providers of all kinds, agents, upstream, but also downstream as regards due diligence providers, making sure that that's really tightened up because that is the flavor of scrutiny. There's a lot of scrutiny coming out of the EU at the moment as regards GDPR, which is data protection, and scrutiny also coming out of China in a slightly different way, but around whether or not the data of Chinese nationals can be transferred internationally, which by and large is very difficult under Chinese law. So I think these are the two risk areas that need a lot of focus this coming year.
Do you think that mind you, I'm after this interview, I'm going to use this term forever, the Caribbean Five. Do you think that they are doing a good job with making adjustments to their programs as the scrutiny gets harder?
I think the regional regulator is an amazing step. From all the interactions, and I don't have full oversight. I don't work for one of the programs.
Right.
We contract, but don't work for them. I would say that I'm hearing all the right signs. It does seem like the programs are working really hard. But the programs operate in countries, again, that have tiny populations. And so, if you've got a population of less than 100,000, you need the support of international partners who are truly committed to the integrity and long-term longevity of the programs rather than international parties that might just be looking at the next commission payment. And so international collaboration and support is integral just because the Caribbean otherwise is very vulnerable, as we say, to all the scrutiny attached to the fact that they are receiving applications from across the world. And it's very, very difficult for small populations to fully understand all the risks in every single part of the world without that international support.
Agreed. So, are there any new data points, intelligence trends, or frameworks you'll be sharing publicly for the first time at
Excellent. It's a
CIS
really good
26?
question. I guess that's a bit TBC. I will
No.
say that
Okay.
I'd mentioned the community of practice that I'm heading up, and there are four other sort of due diligence firms part of it, and that's under the auspices, as I said, of the IMC. We're working together to create a white paper explaining best practice in due diligence at the applicant onboarding stage. And my aspirations for this go broader than just that one white paper. My aspirations, as I said, is to onshore to the extent possible a lot of the knowledge that can be done from a computer, right? So there is no reason why a person in St. Lucia who works for the St. Lucia Citizenship by Investment Program or any other of the Caribbean Five cannot be doing the online aspects of the due diligence at the applicant onboarding stage. Obviously, if there is capacity, right? And
Right.
that sort of ebbs and flows with volume and demand. And so I would really hope to be sharing knowledge about that kind of stuff because ultimately, let's say some of the programs have recently come up for a sort of 10 to 12-year anniversary. They're still young.
Yeah.
So as these programs mature, ensuring that knowledge and making sure it's in the local economy,
Yeah.
is integral. It helps with other things. It helps with legal services. It helps with financial services as well. And it also obviously provides, in itself, can provide economic diversification away from sort of tourism and the service sector to onshore some of that knowledge. So I really hope to be exchanging that sort of knowledge at CIS, particularly because it's in the Caribbean.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So, what major global risk trends do you anticipate shaping investment migration all the way through to 2027?
Yeah, good question. So at Control Risks, we have something called Risk Map. And Risk Map is an annual event where we outline the risks that we see for the coming year. And I'm not going to go through, there are five for 2026, but one is the competition for compute. By compute, we mean it in the sense of a noun. So compute means the ability, it basically means like data centers, water, electricity, the ability to provide what is needed to run AI and automation. And I think that compete for compute also is really going to shape CBI. Not because AI, I mean, AI is going to shape everything, but not, I'm not talking here about AI, but I'm talking about the competition also for the raw data. So there is a sense that the CBI programs handle so much raw data, which is actually economically valuable. So all the data we have, or the programs themselves have about the income of an investor, the net worth of the investor, the assets of the investor, that kind of stuff. I can see that being a competitive advantage as well as a risk area, right? If it's not handled correctly. So I really think that that is a risk area and an opportunity area that is going to come to the fore in 2027. When we talk about how data is being stored, whether it's secure, but also can the program itself, right, when asked, truly say whether data that they've collected about the investor is held sort of subsequently. Which third parties have it? Have they deleted it? What have they done with it? All of
Right.
that. So I think that's a key risk trend that is increasingly coming to the fore across the world, but it's very relevant to CBI.
So, how should the Caribbean CBI programs future proof themselves today then?
Excellent. So I guess biometrics are one key, very tangible development that I'm seeing a lot of progress in that regard. I really think that's incredibly important. A few other things, regulating international marketing agents, so making sure that the programs themselves are aware of how their countries, because let's face it, it's the whole country, is being
Right.
portrayed across the world. Really, really important. Another one, as I said, is around, well, it's always around diplomatic dialogue. I don't think that's new. But making sure that the advantages and the opportunities attached to the programs are fully understood by international stakeholders. It's not enough, obviously, to be saying, oh, CBI brings in X revenue for the country. It also has to be expressed how that revenue is being used and how it's being used to transform and shape the economy, how it's trickling down to local populations. There are a few aspects I think that are very pertinent to 2026 and 2027. One of them being climate. And I guess whenever I go to the Caribbean, I hear from everyone, and it's not just elites, it's not just educated people, how climate change is impacting their lives, right? How sea levels are rising and everything, right? And, climate change of all types, be it a hurricane or be it the slower sort of onset events. Um, and I know at COPs, the annual COPs under the auspices of the UN, the Caribbean Five are actually they take center stage as regards climate related issues, including climate justice. And so if the CBI revenue and a very clear and transparent and obviously accurate narrative around how CBI revenue plays into that narrative can be expressed in the right rooms, which obviously I'm not going to be in, but those diplomatic rooms, I can see that shifting certain opinion. I can also see it shifting public opinion across the world if, again, the narrative as to how the programs are using the funds that are generated and how they're using them for the positive and long-term development of their countries is expressed in the right sort of forums and to the right audiences.
Understood. So, what emerging risk vectors in the industry are we underestimating right now?
Ooh, again, I need to hark back to identity fraud. I think that's one of the key emerging risk vectors. And the other one, again, is the way that all third parties are using the data that is collected about investors, right? I think they're the
Right.
two key vectors. When you read, it's really interesting because when you do, and from time to time, there are scandals relating to CBI, and let's face it, they exist. CBI
Okay.
is not 100, nothing, no industry is risk-free, right? CBI is not risk-free. And I think it's really, really important for firms like Control Risks and others to be very clear that we are not safeguarding from all risk. There will be applicants that are onboarded through nefarious means, through fraudulent means as well. But when you read news stories about an applicant who did attain the passport through misrepresentation or attained the passport despite already having criminal convictions, etc., normally these stories only hit the media 10 years after the passport was issued, right? After the event. And so it's really, really important, again, to safeguard now for future risks. And that's why I think, again, identity fraud is key.
Right.
There is a global scrutiny of identity fraud and let's face it, immigration and emigration is only going to get more intense. You know, in 10 years' time, there will be more global scrutiny of these issues. And also around the integrity and sovereignty of data about individuals and how that's held and transferred and kept. So I think these are the two kind of risk vectors that the programs have to be very, very aware of.
Agreed 100%. Well, Fabienne, thank you for an insightful and informative conversation today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
No.
your questions, Tessa.
If today proves anything, it's this. In the new architecture of investment migration, risk is the currency that determines access, credibility, and longevity. Intelligence isn't optional, it's strategic leverage. And governance is no longer a background function, it is the front and center in shaping trust, resilience, and long-term viability. Thank you for joining us today. And for those of you who are still on the fence about coming to CIS 26, conversations like this will continue. So, see you in St. Lucia.